Yes. So I met Andy as part of being both being a part of the working group on the standard for ethical considerations in emulated empathy in autonomous and intelligent systems. So it's an IEEE endeavor. And I've since followed his work, and I thought it might be interesting and valuable for our department and our seminars. So I introduced Andrew McStay, who is a professor of digital life at Bangor University, UK, and is the director of the Emotional AI Lab, and has a recent book titled Emotion AI, The Rise of Empathic Media. And yes, I leave him to introduce his talk himself, and I look forward to your talk, Andy. Over to you.
Cool, thank you, Demi. Yeah, and thank you everyone for the warm introduction and for dialing in. I, do appreciate there are a lot of meetings and there are a lot of calls. So yeah, so it's good that you could make it here. I think, yeah, for me, this is a different sort of talk. My normal audience is people from social science background, humanities, law, policy, and so on. So there's an element of kind of feeling like I'm entering the lion's den here. So yeah, so thank you for the warm introduction and kind of put me kind of slightly at ease, I guess. I think, yeah, one of the upsides of kind of doing this talk to such a group is that normally I spend half my presentations talking about how affect and emotion systems work, and that it doesn't just involve facial coding, that there is a lot more to all of this. So yes, it's good to be speaking to this group and not to have to, to kind of trot through all of that. I think, it's interesting, isn't it? Some people on this call will have been looking at these technologies for years and some kind of for a shorter period of time. But certainly in recent years, it's an area that's been increasing policy attention, and receiving a high degree of policy attention. So it's against this background, really, particularly kind of the policy angle that, that kind of this talk is motivated. So in terms of what I want to do in this talk, I'll be speaking for around half an hour. So Temi, if I go over half an hour from now, give me a nudge, give me a shout. Yeah, and I'll pull back because I'd like to leave a lot of time for discussion and conversation. But structure of the talk is to think a little bit about the policy context and think about the wide range of use cases that are emerging at the moment. And again, I appreciate this is a mixed group. So some of the applications will be very familiar to some people on this call, and possibly some of the use cases won't be. And I think at least one or two of the use cases that will be presented will be quite new to us all, and maybe that will give us a point to talk about in the discussion part of our call. And yeah, and after kind of talking about some use cases, I'll talk about some of the citizen-oriented findings that we've kind of been unearthing at the Emotional AI Lab in relation to how people feel about these technologies, in what context, and yeah, and kind of which areas do kind of citizens and people tend to have most concern about. Before we get going properly, can I just give a shout out as well to kind of the team who have been involved in some of the background for this research. So involves Diana Miranda from Stirling, Lachlan Urquhart from Edinburgh, Alex Laffer, who's with us at Bangor, Vian Bakir from Bangor, and Gilad Rosner, who's independent but living in Barcelona. So I think, one of the key things with kind of affective computing, emotional AI, emotional AI, emotion AI, empathic computing, call it what you will. But there's definitely seems to be a bit of a language issue here. And I know kind of one of the key phrases that come to mind is this idea of, we kind of talk about all these kind of new names, such as empathic computing that Temi mentioned a moment ago. Are we talking about old wine in new bottles here? And it kind of reminds me of a passage in Lucy Suchman's book, where she's discussing kind of Rosalind Picard and Picard's kind of reflections on why she chose affective computing. One of the reasons why she chose affective computing is in part because, she was kind of developing this kind of in the mid-90s. And again, MIT at that time was, it was a pretty masculine environment, and AI was dominated by kind of rational decision making. So the idea of a woman developing kind of technologies to kind of study and interact with emotion, it's really interesting that she went for the word affect rather than emotion, despite the fact that what she was really interested in was emotion. So again, perhaps some of you actually know Rosalind herself, but it'd be interesting to ask her that question to see to what extent this kind of really influenced her choice of name. But whichever way around, for the purposes of this talk, I'll use the term emotion recognition, and it's a flawed and imperfect term, as we'll get onto in a moment, but it's the expression that policymakers do seem to have landed on. And again, we'll get into some of the policy stuff in a moment. But yeah, I'll be using the emotion recognition primarily. Oops, but yeah, but as we know though, emotion science isn't at all straightforward. I'm sorry, just bear with me a second. Yeah, but as we kind of all know, kind of emotion science and emotion recognition itself is not all straightforward. And I think this tweet tells us something. So it's a tweet, it's not a PhD thesis. So, we probably shouldn't deconstruct it too seriously. But I think it's quite illustrative of kind of the concerns that policymakers, NGOs, social scientists, and civil society bodies tend to have about the domain of emotion recognition or affective computing and so on. I think, just to dissect the tweet, again, it's interesting that kind of emotions are something to be found inside, deep within us, and that they can be mined and that they can be computationally rendered, leaving them to be able to be put to work for kind of a range of purposes. And again, while it's unfair, I think, to kind of take a tweet too far to task, I think it kind of makes so many kind of suppositions about the nature of emotions, and I think this seems to be kind of the issue that's kind of really stirred up a lot of the criticism around these technologies, particularly kind of in policy circles. But I think, as we know, there are kind of a range of definitions and approaches to emotion. So we have kind of William James from all the way back in kind of the 1880s, who talked about kind of feelings and the quality or the kind of experiences of autonomic bodily changes. Others, such as the pragmatist John Dewey, again spoke of excited states, overlapping with this kind of idea of qualia. But behaviorists, of course, take other perspectives, denying kind of the role of experience and literally just kind of speaking in terms of dispositions of the body. Whereas other kind of philosophers and psychologists tend to talk about kind of appraisal-based approaches, possibly kind of one of the more kind of slightly fashionable approaches to emotion at the moment. Other philosophers such as Martha Nussbaum, talk about judging and the role of emotions in helping us to decide and judge. Also kind of linking with kind of moral decision making, which I think is quite a unique take to emotion. And then we kind of get on to kind of the approaches which, probably more kind of closely related to kind of affective computing in terms of kind of Tonkin's early work on kind of facial expressions, and then kind of on to Ekman, who I think everybody on this call will know quite well. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think, when we kind of think about kind of some of the criticisms of these technologies and of these approaches, it's really interesting how there's basically Lisa Feldman Barrett is kind of almost the kind of go-to source for this. So it's a rejection of Ekman in favor of Lisa Feldman Barrett. Her work that kind of draws on kind of Russell and the idea of kind of more kind of social constructionist approaches to emotion. Well, I think, I'm going to kind of avoid kind of going down the psychological rabbit hole today, but I do find Andrea Scantido's work really interesting, and possibly even the suggestion that emotion itself is just so heterogeneous that perhaps and possibly, that emotion itself might be so kind of heterogeneous that the premise may be fallacious, which, is the deconstructionist rabbit hole. So yeah, we won't go too far into that. And this is the last of long bullet pointed slides, I should add. But in terms of the kind of definition, which probably I'm fairly comfortable with, notwithstanding Scarantino's rabbit holes, in terms of what emotions are, I think de Mello's approach seems quite sensible to me, and that involves conceptual entities, that arise from brain, body, environment interactions. And that seems comfortable. It seems to embrace the social side of things, but also the body side of things, and also the situational side of things. So to turn to the policy background to emotion recognition systems, there's a lot of change going on at the moment. So within the UK, you'll be well aware that the UK has now left the European Union, which in terms of Whitehall and Cabinet Office is creating a lot of impetus to think about new ways of handling and managing and putting personal data to work. And while emotion recognition itself doesn't feature in the Data A New Direction report, certainly DCMS in their own private research and some of the consultations, I imagine possibly Nadia, you've been involved in some of these, I know I have, there is a real interest in emotion and affect recognition, and thinking about what some of the possibilities for these technologies are and how best to regulate them. And in terms of how best to regulate, not always the same as what's taken place within Europe. But there is a lot of stuff going on in Europe at the moment. I think, yeah, it's really quite a change. I've been looking at the social impact of emotion, affects, and so on for the last 10 years or so. When I got started in this, basically nobody had really even heard of it. Policymakers looked at me slightly bemusedly, asked me to explain the technologies, the applications, how it works. Now we have the proposed AI Act. The proposed AI Act essentially is going to be roughly the same weight and significance as the General Data Protection Regulation. It grew out of the limitations of the GDPR, and right at the top of the proposed AI Act is emotion recognition systems itself. In Part C there, in Article 1, it's right there at the top. I must admit, I was a little surprised to see emotion recognition placed so prominently and discussed so extensively throughout the legislation. But I think anybody working in this area, even if your background is more on the CS and the social science side of things, it really is worth having a scan of both the AI Act itself and the annex that goes with it. In terms of the annex itself, it delineates what it sees as some of the harms and some of the concerns, and how it ranks emotion recognition systems. So in essence, what you have there is a pyramid, and at the base is minimal risk. So basically it's green light, good to go, no real problems here. Emotion recognition itself is deemed as that limited risk. I think in terms of how it's being conceived within the European Commission, it overlaps with chatbots and that kind of things, and voice assistants and so on. But you see biometric categorization there. So a limited risk essentially means that there are transparency obligations. A transparency obligation is basically where a person needs to know what they're interacting with. So for example, in terms of a voices, so if you make a call, you need to know that you're dealing with an automated entity on the other side. And similarly, if there's emotion recognition taking place, a person should be aware that emotion profiling is taking place. But you might note the part about high risk there. So you'll note employment, education, public safety, public services, and safety components of vehicle, law enforcement, and so on. As we'll get on to in a moment, many the prime use cases of emotional recognition very much fall into these categories. So in terms of use in the classroom, in terms of interest in using it in edtech platforms such as Microsoft Teams and so on, In terms of using public services, for example, kind of in transport hubs, as a means of kind of gauging kind of security and so on, whether a person's angry and so on and so forth or not, and in cars as well. Again, possibly to kind of gauge whether somebody's kind of tired and fatigued, or indeed for personalization elements within the vehicle. But in short then, although emotion recognition has been placed within limited risk, my hunch is that as the draft AI Act becomes something, implemented, be a few years yet, I see emotion recognition basically ending up being in a high risk position. But it's going to be interesting to see as well, looking at the top of unacceptable risk in relation to manipulative behavior causing harm. I don't think anybody's kind of seriously kind of arguing that emotion recognition falls into this, but certainly kind of got potential overlaps with mass surveillance. Yeah, there are arguments to be made there, but I think it's fair to say that high risk, the limited to high risk shift is the one that we need to kind of watch out for here. In terms of other policy areas, the UNCRC, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, earlier this year, I think it was September, October, General Comment 25 was released. It's a very dry sounding title, but in essence what it is, it's an update on child human rights, and it tries to factor for the digital environment. So clearly it's important. And what the UNCRC GC25 does, one of the parts of that, it talks about emotion recognition quite extensively. We at the Emotional AI Lab, we kind of we submitted advisory comments for this, and it's really good to see that actually kind of some of the more subtle points were taken on board, that it's not just about kind of facial coding and so on, but it's about kind of attending to HCI questions, human computer interaction questions, and the psychological dimensions thereof. So I think they've approached it in quite a subtle fashion, but again, this is feeding into the AI Act, the proposed AI Act as well. In terms of the EDPS, the European Data Protection Supervisor, in essence, they kind of advise and monitor member states of the European Union in terms of whether they're abiding by kind of relevant legislation. And yeah, it's really interesting to see that they really kind of come out swinging on emotion recognition. So, they're proposing a ban on remote biometric identification in public space, which involves emotion recognition technologies. So again, I think, what you start to see from kind of all of this kind of policy context, that it's pretty fierce at the moment. And there's definitely kind of changes afoot and coming. Part of this is kind of comes from the Council of Europe. So the Council of Europe is kind of an older body kind of set up as a result of World War II. It involves kind of member states within kind of the European Union, but beyond as well. And again, they're really, really concerned about this. So again, you begin to kind of see the tone of kind of thinking and feeling within kind of Europe and beyond around kind of face recognition, kind of emotion, mood and personality tracking, and so on. Oops. Yeah, and finally, again, I think this is a study that was requested for the European Parliament. And what's particularly interesting about this is that typically GDPR considers personal data as data that can be linked back to a living individual in some way, shape or form, or a way that a person can be singled out for special treatment. What this report for the European Parliament suggests, it suggests a separation between biometrics and emotion data. And I think maybe that's kind of something we can come back to in the discussion later on. So possibly one, if you've got kind of a pen there to hand, it's kind of possibly an interesting think point for us, that should biometrics and data about emotion be separated out for kind of separate and special treatment. So yeah, just something for you to think about there. But it's interesting because possibly from your side of things, if you're not kind of quite so immersed in policy, this might be kind of a lot of noise, and a lot of policy noise, and a lot of yeah, possibly a lot of negative feeling. I think it's really interesting, So what you kind of see on the slide in front of you is an exceptionally boring slide. It's a very dry outline of kind of our ML approaches to kind of emotions and kind of facial expressions. So it's kind of interesting that on the one hand, you kind of have kind of policymakers and kind of the NGO communities essentially kind of treating emotion recognition like it was plutonium. And then kind of areas of kind of the CS community possibly kind of scratching their heads, kind of wondering what all the fuss is about. Again, I'd be interested in kind of when we get into kind of some of the kind of discussion later, just to talk about the variance between the communities here. But yeah, I think the mundaneness and the boringness of this slide, I find actually quite illustrative in its own way. But to kind of crystallize what kind of some of the motivating concerns and what areas kind of really seem to be disturbing policymakers, there seems to be kind of a number of issues that seem to be recurring. So part of it is driven by bias, and this overlaps from other kind of concerns about AI and machine learning, but it's certainly kind of spilling into emotion recognition as well in relation to kind of training data, where it comes from, system weighting, and the hardware itself. And certainly in kind of our own social science work, it's really, really, really hard to get a sense where businesses and corporations, how they are training their systems and where the data is coming from. So we look particularly at the car market, and so hard to get a sense of how the training data was constituted, and to what extent it was representative. Which kind of leads on to kind of accuracy questions. And I think, accuracy does link to bias, but I think it kind of has special relevance here, doesn't it? Because of the ambiguous nature of emotion itself, which then kind of brings us on to kind of baselines and thresholds. And that, when we start thinking about trying to deploy systems in national contexts or beyond, it's problematic in so many ways. And it's been interesting, one of the projects that we have on the go as well, we're comparing kind of British and Japanese approaches. And it's interesting to look at Japanese companies who are working with kind of emotion recognition, and they have a fundamentally different set of basic emotions. So for example, sorrow, for one company, is a basic emotion, which is quite a kind of a fascinating approach. But yeah, freedom of thought, kind of concerns about kind of manipulation and influence, privacy, agency. I think as well, other concerns, particularly in kind of GC25, the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child, again, questionable relationships between kind of subjects and objects, toys and voice assistants, and that kind of thing. We'll get into it in a moment as well, in terms of kind of the connection between emotion and politics. And I think it's probably kind of fair to say that, over recent years, not just in the US and the UK, but around the world, the political life has become so incredibly emotionalized, in part through social media, that the profiling of this for political gain is very, very questionable. So yeah, I'll move on from there. And in terms of other backgrounds, and other kind of concerns, I think it's really interesting to kind of look at kind of some of the kind of the historical concerns around this as well. And so some of you may be aware that kind of this overlaps with kind of physiognomy. So physiognomy, in essence, is about kind of judging kind of personality and human disposition from physical profiling. And so much of the criticism from the NGO and human rights community is looking at this overlap between physiognomy in terms of kind of cranial shape and kind of facial expressions and kind of facial features, perhaps more accurately, and personality. And I think, in terms of kind of this idea of kind of being able to kind of I guess kind of in kind of reverse inference in terms of looking at the expression and kind of judging what's going on deep inside, as that tweet said earlier, that seems very problematic for many. And I think the overlap between physiognomy and kind of contemporary pro certainly is kind of very problematic for many. Like one of the reasons for that is, it's very, very, very kind of racially based. I think this is from Lavater's physiognomy from around kind of 1792, that is on the slide there. And this is kind of one of the last pages of the book. And in terms of, the quote is kind of quite amazing in terms of kind of who gets to receive kind of the positive virtues, who gets to be ascribed these kind of principles of genius and positive virtues, and possibly unsurprisingly, they're profoundly European. You read the rest of the other book, other people from different regions of the world and other kind of skin colors and other cranial shapes tend to feature differently. So you see that there's kind of a background for kind of modern concerns about kind of racial bias in profiling. And I think that tends to be the fear around this. So I think, this kind of possibly leads to a question. And again, I'll be really interested in your thoughts about this in the discussion part. And that kind of face-based physiognomy was racist. There's no doubt about that. And modern emotion recognition profiles, builds taxonomies of faces, build mathematical and geodesic grids of faces. So formally, actually quite similar. So does it follow that the conclusion that face-based emotion recognition is racist? And yeah, I'd be really interested in your thoughts about this and any kind of historical thoughts that you have in that regard. But certainly this seems to be the premise of much criticism. I'm not so sure, but either way, it's an unhappy history for face-based profiling. I think it's one that kind of certainly we all have to be aware of, whether we're working directly in this area or studying it. One of the reasons is because we have companies like this. So Faceception, I must admit, I kind of came across this 4 or 5 years ago. I thought it was a joke in terms of a facial personality analytics company. It's not a joke. They do kind of quite, they do quite a lot of business. Again, so they've kind of been around for some time now, working with kind of a number of kind of states, regions, and countries. So the idea of kind of being able to kind of judge faces and judge whether kind of somebody is a terrorist, a pedophile, and so on and so forth, that's the sell of this company. So I think although, kind of claims like this kind of seem a little bit outlandish, I think when we kind of think about where we are today, these ideas are still in business. So just to turn to a few of the use cases, I won't linger on these too much because I'm mindful of time. I think it's interesting just to pick up on some of the leading use cases from some of the larger companies who are developing emotion recognition systems. So many of you will be aware that you'll have Spotify accounts. In essence, kind of Spotify, clusters and kind of offers suggestions on the basis of kind of tone, emotion, and things that you've been interested in the past. But Spotify moving towards more direct emotion profiling through kind of audio and kind of voice-based insights. So you kind of see on the chart here, you kind of have speech recognition on the left, but looking in the center, you kind of have metadata of emotion state, gender, age, accent. Also in relation to context. So it's interesting to think back, that some of the criticisms of emotional recognition tend to be all about faces, and it all tends to be kind of problems with Ekman. And what Spotify try to do is trying to factor for context in terms of where a person tends to be, who they're with, and so on, to offer recommendations thereof. So you see the industry itself responding to some of the criticisms of basic emotions and whatnot. And then there's the metaverse. Who knows? Is this going to be a big thing? Or is this just a sales pitch? We don't know. But I think what's really interesting is that it's not just kind of Facebook, it's Microsoft as well. Microsoft Teams is moving to an online context. So in terms of kind of emotion profiling, this is going to kind of give an exponential boost to the sector. Be it kind of use of cameras to kind of gauge expressions and render those in world. Or more core biometrics, or of course, whether it's kind of through kind of VR goggles and kind of judging kind of sensors on movement of the face and whatnot. So we'll see on this, but definitely kind of emotional recognition and metaverse context is kind of one to watch, both in terms of kind of entertainment and kind of sociality, but also in terms of work. And I think for me, it's kind of Microsoft's involvement in this that kind of makes it all a little bit more serious. And there's recruitment as well. I think recruitment is kind of really interesting. Both one, I don't like the idea personally, but I think it's interesting in terms of kind of the bias issue that, HireVue itself as kind of using kind of emotion analytics in their recruitment services. Part of their claim is to reduce in-person bias in the recruitment process. And I think that's interesting. And again, that could be possibly one for us to get into in the conversation as well, in terms of not just that emotional recognition and kind of machine learning systems have kind of profound problems with issue of bias, but to what extent kind of they help solve some of this as well. But certainly in terms of kind of how policymakers are looking at this, recruitment and the workplace itself is a big area. Well, this slide is slightly old now. It's from 2018. Since I've been kind of looking at this, Amazon for years and years have been trying to kind of launch a voice-based emotion recognition system. And I think, what this kind of points to is that it's really hard to do, possibly given kind of some of those kind of ethnocentric questions that we mentioned a moment ago in terms of kind of region, place, personal thresholds and all of that kind of thing. But interesting that Amazon have been working on this for some time. Cars, again, are particularly interesting. One of the reasons why cars are interesting is because this is the area that has the kind of greatest policy backing. So in the European Union, there's a policy what's known as kind of Vision Zero. The idea is to reduce road death to zero. And one of the ways, the prime way of doing this is through kind of use of onboard cameras and new kind of telematics. So one could argue that maybe if we just got people on public transport, maybe that would be one way, but no, the idea is kind of in-car profiling. So in terms of kind of people where they're kind of sleepy, fatigued at the wheel, distracted, and possibly angry as well. So from the European Union side of things, it's getting a lot of policy backing from Euro NCAP, which is it's not quite a standards body, but it's kind of close. It's close to being an industry standards body. There's a lot of interest there. So I think in terms of kind of use cases, which we're kind of going to see kind of sooner rather than later, I suspect this will be one of them. And then there's children as well, another area of kind of real concern for the Commission. And we've done a lot of work with, not with children per se, but with parents. And it's been really interesting for us to get a sense from parents in kind of both national surveys, national quant-based surveys, to get a sense of kind of a sense of ambivalence. That on the one hand, there kind of real privacy concerns around these technologies, but also if it can help with parenting as well, they're interested. So there's a real ambivalence in kind of the data that we get back from this. And this is kind of, we've done a number of kind of focus groups and quite a bit of qualitative work in this area as well. And again, there's kind of a real kind of tension in between what is best for their children, but also concern about who has access to that data. Would companies, for example, have a responsibility to share that data if there are any signals kind of pointing out that a child was being harmed in some ways? So lots of kind of really kind of complex feelings and thoughts around that, but certainly kind of the children's sector is definitely a thorny one. I'm going to skip retail, just kind of in kind of, I'm getting slightly mindful of time. In terms of use in advertising, this is kind of one of the bigger areas, particularly in the UK. So an advertising agency called M&C Saatchi started playing with affective emotion recognition, I think back in 2014-15 now, having kind of interactive billboards on Oxford Street, and I think in Clapham as well. And basically the idea, there was kind of a Microsoft Connect camera there that was kind of just using a really kind of basic form of sentiment analysis to see whether somebody was positive, negative, and indifferent. But the ad would change as a result of kind of receiving more negatives with a view to kind of receiving more positive responses. And that for me was kind of one of the more interesting examples, in that it really kind of did seem to pretend something in relation to kind of the kind of media environment, kind of a slightly more kind of liquid dynamic media environment, if you like, mediated by emotion. But of course, we've kind of focused on biometrics, but sentiment analysis and political campaigning is kind of huge, particularly if we kind of include social media companies such as Facebook and the psychological profiling therein. And I think, that kind of leads us on to kind of being able to kind of think about what the leading concerns are for UK citizens. And overall, this is kind of it's a recent kind of high-level survey that we've conducted. I think it's from January 2020, so relatively recent. And it's interesting to consider in that if we look, if we just kind of move down from social media for a moment to workplaces and school classrooms, this tallies really well with the AI Act itself. That kind of looks at kind of children in education and workplaces as two key sites of kind of real kind of high-level concern. But it's interesting because I think, the knee-jerk reaction, certainly for me and others as well, is that biometrics are inherently more problematic. And certainly from a kind of a UK point of view, the social media for political profiling, for political campaigning and use of sentiment analysis to target advertising messages for political ends, that was kind of quite overwhelmingly of greater concern of UK citizens who basically say they're not okay with this. And it's quite the size of the sample is pretty reasonable as well. It's over 2,000 people, and it kind of echoes earlier work that we've done as well. So this survey isn't just a one-off finding; it comes from a kind of series of survey work that we've done. But again, workplaces especially kind of flagged as problematic, along with schools. Interestingly, cars, 45 people not okay. It's still not a great statistic, but there does seem to be some kind of interest there. I.e., if we kind of flip that and say 55% are more open to it, and kind of same with kind of ads outdoors as well. I think the other thing to take away as well is kind of the age-based dimension of this. So I've just kind of pulled from one example here on workplaces itself. So if you look to the left, you kind of have 18 to 24-year-olds, and you have kind of 45% who are kind of not okay with any form of emotion profiling in the workplaces. So in terms of kind of things that we asked about scanning kind of emails for kind of sentiment and tone of emails, in terms of voice, such as in teleworkers, for example, having their kind of tone of voice measured, and possibly kind of cameras around the workplace as well. So young people, 45% are not okay with it, but it isn't the 50%. Kind of scaling upwards, but interestingly, whereas for most case examples that we look at, there's a steady kind of upward trend of not okay. So 45% on the left here, and for the 65 to 74s, it's 61. But you kind of see it kind of goes up, and then it actually comes down a bit. But when people have possibly retired, which is quite interesting in that regard, normally it's kind of just a straight upward line. I think it's important to say as well that we've kind of found in qualitative work and other work, this is not to say that kind of the kids don't care about privacy or anything along those lines. It's not, they're just kind of they are kind of more open to different forms of interaction and new forms of interactivity. So yeah, I think one has to be very, very careful in terms of saying that kind of the young people are okay. They don't care about privacy. We don't see that. In terms of kind of other work that we've been doing as well, we've been interested in what are kind of known as personal data stores or personal information management systems. In essence, what they do, pardon me. So what they do, they essentially allow people to store and manage and control their own personal data. and to share and license that data in situations that they're happy with. So in many ways, these apps and services are kind of an attempt to kind of move control away from kind of the cloud-based companies, where we don't really kind of have any kind of the option of kind of whether to share or not. And emotion does factor into this. And one of the things that we were interested in is the extent to which people would be willing to share data about their emotion in certain circumstances. So for example, if a person was going to a retail environment, would you kind of be interested in kind of sharing kind of personal biometrics in terms of body shape, but maybe also about reactivity to kind of install prompts as well, possibly in return for a kind of enhanced service, money off, that kind of thing. So it would be entirely opt-in, but that kind of then led us to the question of, well, to what extent would people be willing to sell this data and sell this information, which kind of takes one into kind of philosophical conundrums, because in essence what you're doing is kind of putting emotion data in markets. You're making it a market-based commodity. You're in essence kind of making privacy a commodity, something that can be bought, sold, and exchanged. And there's a good argument that kind of such intimate dimensions of human life are beyond the moral limits of markets. But it was quite interesting in terms of kind of the feedback that we got. So we were interested in what context people would be willing to sell personal data. So starting from the top, in terms of looking where that green arrow is, in terms of people who are willing to sell, people are willing to sell to the NHS. So for example, in terms of kind of opting in to kind of participate in studies, there might be kind of an incentive. And then academic research as well kind of tend to kind of to become quite favorable. Mental health charities, and this kind of overlaps with kind of existing use cases where kind of organizations such as the Samaritans have been really interested in kind of using kind of social media to profile for their services. And interestingly, kind of private and drug health companies really kind of oscillating in the middle. And then it kind of scrolls downwards, all the way down to kind of political parties, elections, and referenda. This project and work was entirely separate from that 2020 survey that I showed earlier. So it kind of confirms that it gives us a bit of confidence that people really hate the idea of having kind of emotions involved in anything to do with elections and referenda, such as Brexit, of course. But it's an interesting kind of set of sliding scales there. And I think, given where we are in the UK as well, as we kind of leave Brexit, there's a real interest in kind of using data in kind of more interesting ways, not just kind of having it exploited by the large platforms, but being able to kind of liberalize it and kind of find different kind of ways of kind of generating value from it. And it's kind of seems to suggest some kind of openness to these types of approaches. So to conclude, Temi, I'm guessing I've gone way over here, so many apologies to you and everybody. But just to conclude, I think, in my view, when it kind of comes to emotional recognition, I tend to inhabit kind of the kind of more critical side of this world. And I think the way of use cases today is not exactly kind of socially positive so far, but I think there are good things that can be done with these approaches and these technologies. But in terms of ethics, I think there's kind of a clear need to kind of diversify who gets to speak, and I'd really urge more qualitative work in this regard, particularly kind of focus group work and national surveys and things, and the kind of the big insight, the big overviews have their value, but it's really interesting to see what gets surfaced in the qualitative work. In terms of on the policy level, the AI Act, certainly kind of on the basis of work that we're doing, it seems to be prioritizing the right areas. And there's other work kind of going on in Europe around kind of disinformation, misinformation, and use of data in social and electioneering. But in terms of kind of the biometric side of things that the AI Act focuses on, it's focusing on children and work, that kind of, in addition to kind of insurance. It seems to be getting things right. DCMS are looking really closely at this. So for those of you with connections, it's a good time to be talking to them, because they want ethical advice on this, and in both ways, as well as kind of the harms, also what good actually looks like with these technologies. And clearly, you'll be well placed to offer those insights. So yeah, I'll stop there. But these were some think points that you know, kind of I thought about as we kind of went, as I was kind of putting the talk together. But hopefully you've got some of the questions as well. But thank you very much.